Okay, so I am Phil Cunningham. I am an assistant professor of media studies at Wake Forest University. And I wrote a chapter called The Diabolical Master of Black Magic. And so, really, what it looks at is a character who appears in a couple issues of Fox Syndicate comics, most notably the Flame and Weird comics. A character who is called Boanga in some cases, but in other cases, it's simply referred to as the Voodoo Master. And so, what I learned about this character, who I just discovered on happenstance, is that he actually is able to sort of navigate this world in which, and particularly a besieged Haiti post or maybe even during American occupation, in ways that we don't typically see a Black character do, even contemporarily. So I've
Yeah.
written before about Black supervillains and how they sort of lack agency. And he actually has a fair degree of agency in his comics, and that really caught my attention. And so I decided to investigate a little bit of it in my chapter.
From your research.
So the first is what I found really particularly interesting is that in most cases we're kind of the comics of that era are very different from our contemporary comics, right? They're first when you pick up an issue of the Flame, you're not getting just a story about the Flame, you're getting seven
Right.
or eight actual different strips. And so that's one thing I think we can learn from the comics of this time, which is that they're not as serialized as, they're very episodic. They're not quite as serialized as, or there's not a sustained arc in many cases.
That's
I
right.
think the other thing, again, is that, particularly for the Voodoo Man, which is that um, with it, there's a whole wave of interest in voodoo in Haiti that that these series of strips are
Mhm.
negotiating with. And so prior to this, the voodoo or what we call Imagine Voodoo, and this fascination with Haiti takes place in the films. And what I would say is we can see how the relationship between film and comics is very close at this time. I mean, there's a really great book, movie comics, about that. So I think you see a lot of that, particularly in the Voodoo Man. And then I would say again, for the genre itself, jungle comics are particularly popular at this time. And this particular strip, I think, negotiates with some of the tropes of those. So you see all the typical white man in a sort of jungle sphere negotiating with the natives, and the natives are very subservient. But in this case, we have a character who has a lot more agency and
Mhm.
ability to sort of go tete-a-tete with the folks who are occupying his land. And I would say, just last thing, that unlike many of the other jungle comics in which the hero is often white, and their entrance into this land is often seen as benevolent or altruistic,
Mhm.
there are some issues of this strip where that's not necessarily the case, and where they present white men in particular as interlopers or folks who are exploiting that land. And so to see a relatively complicated, complex character for this time,
Mhm.
I found to be very, very interesting.
Yeah, I think when I teach this kind of material with my students, they don't really realize just how popular jungle comics were. And it wasn't just Tarzan, there were dozens and dozens of knockoffs and other versions. And it feels strange to them to see it today, but they were extremely popular and, of course, become part of the framework for Black Panther, which they kind of don't put that together until you start to see what was going on in the 40s and 50s.
And my students are always surprised that, for example, um, Black Panther's comics were Jungle Adventure
That's
for
right.
the longest time before he goes off into sort of the titular series. And yeah, so you're absolutely right.
Hmm. So, can you tell us? I've been showing some images while you've been speaking, but can you tell us a little bit more detail about one of the scenes or the images that you discuss in the chapter?
So this image that you have now is actually a really good one to talk a little bit about, because it shows a couple of things. One, it shows that well, the name Belanga gets sort of used a lot, and it shows sort of how the author, and the author is listed as Alan Spector,
Mhm.
which is clearly a ghostwritten name. And I couldn't really find out who that actually is, but it sort of shows how he's conflating being Haitian with being African. So Boanga, for example, is a very Congolese name in origin.
Okay.
And there's just some real inconsistencies with the portrayal of the Voodoo Man, which I think we're seeing just because the genre itself is still developing in the
Mm.
like. So I think that's clear from this. But I think also what's interesting about this particular image is that it shows that unlike most of the sort of voodoo witch doctors of this era, where they seem to be just out for themselves and seem to be just seeking power, in some cases, Boanga, the voodoo man, sort of is seeking. He seeks dominion in some cases. Sometimes he just seeks revenge. In this particular case, there seems to be, in this instance, they're showing prior to this that sort of white men from America are encroaching upon their voodoo rituals.
Mhm.
And someone approaches him, Boanga, to sort of suggest, hey, we need help. These interlopers are on our land. And so he's willing to go out and stop these folks from intruding upon their voodoo rituals. So again, the series is very inconsistent in that regard, but
Okay.
it shows here that at least in one instance, Boang is acting altruistically or not solely in self-interest.